Back in 2013, a French business jet was getting ready to fly from the Dominican Republic to France. But surprise! Just before takeoff, the drug enforcement team raided the plane and found 26 suitcases with 700 grams of cocaine inside. What's crazy is that the people who owned the plane claimed they had nothing to do with the drugs and didn't know anything about them. Because they denied everything, they got arrested and banned from leaving the country under surveillance. From that moment on, the story takes a wild turn. Two of them come up with a crazy plan to escape and get back to their own country. The strange part is, who really owns the plane? Here's everything that was forbidden and how it got on the plane. Most importantly, will the suspects manage to escape and get back to their country or not? Stay tuned and enjoy the story. Peace be upon you and welcome to your home. On March 19, 2013, there was a French plane belonging to a company that rents planes for businessmen getting ready in the Dominican Republic to take a night flight to France. Suddenly, the people on board saw a helicopter approaching them. Then, agents from the Drug Enforcement Administration stormed in, pointing their guns and ordering everyone to get off the plane. After that, they arrested everyone on board and started opening some bags too. They searched it and, surprise, found it full of bags that are totally banned. At first, the pilots thought it was some kind of misunderstanding that would be resolved right away, but what actually happened was the complete opposite. Imagine, inside the plane there were 26 bags full of cocaine, with the total weight being 700 kilos, massive, seriously, and the value was over 50 million euros. The cocaine plane case was handed over to an investigating judge in France named Christine. She's the woman handling specialized organized crime cases since the plane took off from the Dominican Republic and was supposed to land in France, so she was in charge of the whole case. She's literally the one. You'll do whatever it takes to solve the case, and sometimes you'll totally mess up, so pay close attention to the story because it's full of crazy events. Anyway, when Christine took on the case, she found out that the plane was loaded with 26 bags containing 700 grams of contraband, and there were 4 people on board. After the raid, 2 of them were arrested. They were the pilots, one named Pascal Fourrier and the other Bruno Oudes. Their backgrounds were clean, meaning they weren't involved in any illegal stuff. But the strange thing was what they were doing on the plane with such a huge amount of contraband. The third person, they were with them, and he was also a pilot named Alain Castani. He's a former pilot and hadn't raised any suspicions before, but no one knew why he was on the plane. The 4th person with them was Nicolas Bizabia, a French businessman, but he wasn't well known in the country. After the 4 were arrested in the Dominican Republic, they were handcuffed and taken into custody, kept under tight surveillance until April 3, 2013. That's when the first trial session started. Each of them gave their testimony, saying what their role was and what they were doing on the plane, insisting they were innocent and didn't know about the illegal stuff in the bags. Now, here's the strange part. They told them the pilots Bruno and Pascal used to work in the military. Before getting into business aviation, they were military pilots for 19 years, flying all kinds of planes. They even had clearance to fly while carrying nuclear weapons, so in the military, they held serious official responsibilities. I mean, guys like that, how could they end up on a plane loaded with contraband? As they approached retirement age, they finished their military service and got hired by a small business aviation company called Ascent HS, and they were really grateful for the job. As for the third pilot, Castani, he told them that the third pilot joined the crew to help the other 2 pilots because the flight was long. This guy had been working in business aviation for a long time, and he didn't seem like someone who would get involved in smuggling anything illegal. As for the 4th person, the passenger Nicolas Bizabia, a businessman, those bags were supposed to be his since he was the only passenger on the plane. But he told them he didn't know where the bags came from or who they belonged to. He went through border control before boarding the plane, and there were no issues. They checked his passport and inspected his personal backpack. The guy who was with them didn't tell the authorities about anything suspicious, so he didn't know anything about these bags. Just so you know, private plane flights always take off from an official airport, even if it's a private jet. They go through passport control and border security, get checked smoothly and quickly, and leave officially. When landing, they also arrive at an official airport in the other country, go through border control again, and have their passports checked. Anyway, after the 4 people presented their statements in the Dominican Republic, the judge decided at the second hearing to hold all of them in custody as a precaution for a year while the investigation continues. That's when they took them in. They were sent straight to jail, all 4 of them, and the conditions in the cell were really bad, guys, like, as bad as you can imagine. And to make things worse, the prison they ended up in was one of the worst in the whole country. Anyway, during that time, the investigating judge in France, Christine, who was working on the case, started digging for more evidence. The first thing she tried to figure out was who owned the plane. The airline was small, so not all the planes they used actually belonged to them. They often rented planes from businessmen and transported other businessmen, so basically, the planes they had, the rent was on Christine. She found out that the owner of the plane carrying the contraband was a businessman and optics specialist named Alain Castani. After the case, she accused him of being the smuggler and the secret partner in the operation or something like that. But the guy told her, "No miss, I'm a businessman and an honest man, I have nothing to do with these things." And actually, he was a rich, well-known businessman, close to the media, definitely not the type to get involved in this kind of stuff. He told her, "I own the plane, that's it. Lots of plane owners rent them out, it helps cover maintenance costs." That was the whole story, and honestly, he sounded convincing, so she couldn't prove otherwise. He didn't get in any trouble because he only owned the plane and it was being used without his knowledge for smuggling operations, so he wasn't to blame. Anyway, after that, Christine started investigating the owners of the business aviation company. The owners were two men, one named Pierre-Marc and the other Fabrice. What I found out is that these two guys organized the flight, and it's clear they knew the four people who flew the plane. So she began saying these two are involved in the case and that they arranged the smuggling. But there's something you need to know about the business aviation world. This field is all about exceptional luxury. Wealthy clients flying on these planes are looking for comfort and a sense of extravagance. For example, it's not unusual for one passenger to carry 6 suitcases while another might not bring anything at all. It's not the company's responsibility to know what each passenger is carrying or what's inside their luggage. Judge Christine hasn't found anything against them yet, but she did learn something else. The flight that had the prohibited items on board had the flight attendant removed at the last minute. It was reported that businessman Nicolas Bizabia didn't want any service on the plane and refused to have a flight attendant, even though it was a long trip, so I was pretty surprised, like, how does a flight attendant suddenly get dropped at the last minute? The pilots were saying they're just doing their job and don't know anything about the band stuff. The passenger claims he has no idea about anything and the bag's ownership is unknown, like, who do they belong to? How did the banned items even get on the plane? This whole thing is crazy. After 4 months of those 4 people being arrested in the Dominican Republic, Christine decided to travel there from France because she felt someone was hiding info from her. The best way was to question the 4 of them there, gather info, and try to find out who's involved. I met with them in jail and questioned each one of them. First, I interviewed the pilots, Bruno and Pascal. They told me that just 2 hours before the arrest, they were doing a routine plane inspection and knew there were bags to be taken on the flight. While they were inside, they heard noises coming from outside the plane. Bruno went down to see what was happening, and when he got out, he saw 3 people at the back who he was sure worked at the airport, handling baggage and stuff. After they loaded all the bags and finished, they left the area. Christine was surprised and told them, "You're experienced pilots, and you didn't find it odd that one passenger was carrying 26 bags?" She had a bag and was about to go on a 48-hour trip. The entire trip the businessman Nicolas was taking lasted 48 hours, meaning 2 days. The pilots asked her, "What's the problem here?" "Our job is to fly, we don't know what's inside the bag. It's not our business." They added, "If we opened it, the client could sue us." I told them, "Okay, but what about the weight? Didn't you think it was unusually heavy? Didn't you suspect there might be something illegal inside?" They said, "No, we know that illegal stuff has a distinct smell, but we didn't smell anything." At this point, I doubted what they said because cocaine has a unique smell. But since the charges haven't been proven against them yet, they can't be accused. Then she started questioning the businessman Nicolas, who was the center of attention. He told her, "First of all, I'm not involved with any contraband and I have nothing to do with this whole story. I work in real estate. I used to be a real estate agent in France, then I worked abroad. All my trips are on private jets. By chance, I ended up on that plane, and whatever happened, happened. I got caught up because the bags were mine, but even so, she didn't buy a word I said. She couldn't find any link between me and any properties in the Dominican Republic. As for the third pilot, Castani's announcement, she had no idea what he was doing on the plane. The guy didn't know how to present himself, missed his chance, and she couldn't make sense of him at all. After the interrogation ended and Christine returned to France, a lawyer named Eric Lefrancois showed up and decided to defend the pilots. This lawyer came up with a theory that no one had ever thought of before. He said that during the drug enforcement raid in the Dominican Republic, they were filming a video to document the operation. It was the first time they ever recorded one of their raids. He claimed that the video spread all over the country and the whole point was for the National Drug Enforcement Council to get credit for the operation. So, what's the problem with that? What did they do wrong? That was the theory he was pushing. The raid and putting the contraband on the plane was actually planned by the Drug Enforcement Agency itself at that time. The National Council was in a tough spot because they were being accused of being involved in shady activities and smuggling the confiscated contraband. In other words, the ones supposed to protect it were actually the thieves. The head of the Drug Enforcement Agency, named Oudes, was supposed to be replaced every year, but he caused all this chaos to make sure he got praised and kept his position. It was a move nothing less than underhanded. Later, the lawyer Eric said that the Drug Enforcement Agency recorded the arrests of the pilots and the bags and everything, but they didn't film the contraband that disappeared. Usually, after that, they confiscate it and call the journalists to come document the burning of the confiscated materials, but this time they didn't invite anyone and didn't burn anything. So people started wondering what happened. Did they smuggle it away, confiscate it, or what exactly? He tried to get Judge Christine's attention, but she said they don't have the authority to investigate another country, which is why his claim was ignored. In July 2015, 2 years and 4 months after the arrest of the 4 people, their trial began in the Dominican Republic. Imagine, at that time, they couldn't prove anything related to drug trafficking or the existence of a criminal organization. Nothing was proven, yet the trial went on. It went on for 7 weeks, and in the end, they decided that everyone was guilty and sentenced them to 20 years in prison. But luckily for them, the legal system in the Dominican Republic is different. After the sentence, they didn't send them straight to jail to serve their time. Instead, they decided to release them like a conditional release, but with a catch: they had to stay in the country, never leave, and show up at the prosecutor's office once a month for a check-in. They were under constant surveillance. What the officials there didn't realize was that this ruling was really dumb, and what was about to happen would be crucial evidence later on. The news about their sentencing spread like wildfire in France, and tons of people started supporting them and holding protests to get them released or to push the French government to step in. One of the people who got wind of the story was a guy named Christophe Noten. Christophe is close to the French police and the Interior Ministry. Some even say he works with intelligence and has connections all over France. This guy was friends with the pilot, Pascal, who was accused, and everyone knew Pascal was an honest, respectable guy who would never get involved in stuff like this. So Christophe decided to reach out to another guy for help with the crazy plan he had in mind, the one he asked for help with. His name is Émeric Chobart, a Frenchman who's a member of the European Parliament and an advisor to the President of the Dominican Republic. When he met with him, Émeric said, "You're well connected and close to the President of the Dominican Republic." He then told him a story about the pilots and their past, that they were elite pilots in the country, flying missions carrying nuclear bombs. They always took full responsibility in their work and had sensitive information in their hands. So how could France just leave 2 men like that without helping them? He understood that helping them escape from that country and return home was a patriotic move. Émeric was convinced and decided to help them. The first thing he asked the president was, the Dominican Republic mentioned the possibility of releasing them through politics and negotiation since he was close to the president and had spoken to him. "Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do right now. The case is complicated and I advise you not to get involved in the story." But the brother did the exact opposite and got in touch with Christophe, telling him that they needed to move to the negotiators. So the first thing they did was travel and meet with the pilots. At that time, as we said, they weren't in prison but were under surveillance. Their phones were being tapped and people were watching and following them most of the time, so they couldn't just go anywhere. They had to be careful and insisted they were completely innocent of the charges. No one believed them and they were literally on the verge of breaking down. Every month, they went to the prosecutor, who would do whatever he could to send them back to jail. So Christophe and Émeric offered them the only plan they had, smuggling them from the Dominican Republic to France. At first, they weren't convinced at all. They asked, "What's your goal? What are you going to get out of this?" They said, "Nothing. Actually, we might lose a lot more. But our goal is to help you because we know you're innocent and we trust you." After realizing they had no other plan, they agreed to the idea even though it was risky. The first plan they thought of was to get a helicopter, pick them up, take them to a remote place, then drop them into the sea and pick them up from there with a boat to cross the border. After that, they would hop from island to escape from the Dominican Republic and reach France. But the plan was risky, it involved helicopter smuggling and was complicated, so the pilots refused. They started planning a simpler way. The alternative plan they agreed on was to split into two teams. The first team, led by Christophe, would come with a sailboat to the Dominican Sea border. The second team, consisting of Emmerich and the pilots Bruno and Pascal, would come by speedboat to meet Christophe at the border. Then they'd all get on the sailboat together. They planned to escape the place with a simple, smooth plan so they wouldn't get caught. Since it was an easy and well-thought-out plan, the pilots agreed to it. The main idea was just to smuggle the two of them, but then they wondered what about the third pilot and the businessman Nicolas. Leaving them behind would be a betrayal. But luckily, at that time, he had a car accident and was taken to the hospital because his leg was broken. The problem with businessman Nicolas was that they couldn't trust him, they didn't know him, nor if he would agree to go with them or report them. So they decided not to tell him the plan at all. After the plan was ready and everything was set, Emmerich said that they had to bring a third person into the operation, someone fearless and ready to do whatever they asked. The right guy they found was a former French soldier and a member of the European Parliament named Pierre Malinowski. This guy used to work for a French politician and was pretty much crazy, always up for adventure and challenges. When Emmerich and Christophe asked him if he could organize the smuggling operation, he said, "Of course, that's my thing." Pierre explained he got involved because the pilots were former military guys, so he decided to step in and help. 2 weeks later, Pierre and Emmerich met up. Christophe and the others got together and started going over the plan in detail. The first thing they agreed on was that they'd use fake names, and all the words they used with each other had to be coded because the monitors watching the pilots started getting suspicious of them. They thought something fishy was going on and worried the whole plan might fail. Once they agreed on everything, Pierre went to one of the beaches and met a man who owned a boat. He told him that they were a team planning to shoot a movie at sea. The boat owner took him out several times to scout the area and figure out where the smuggling route led. After going out 4 times and studying all the details, they decided on the plan for the next day. They were about to start the operation. Of course, the pilots felt this crazy mix of tension and fear, words can't even describe it. Even though the mission was simple, there was a big chance they'd get caught. The next morning, on October 18, 2015, the pilots, Pierre and Emmer all headed out together, pretending it was just a sightseeing trip. They kept driving around, trying to lose the people watching them, and finally got away. Then they reached the beach where they were going to escape from at 5 a.m. After that, they all got on the boat. That's what you're seeing in those photos, taken back then as a keepsake. Just remember that, they played a funny role in our story in the end. The feeling of fear and suspicion never left them. The Dominican Republic had a navy and ships that could easily catch them. They were suspicious of them, and the worst part was that the area they came from was known for smuggling. There was literally a danger that they'd be shot at if they were seen rushing, since they might be suspected of smuggling. The distance they were supposed to cover was 64 kilometers to reach the border where Christophe was waiting for them. But suddenly, halfway through, the boat owner recognized the pilots as the ones famous for the drug plane case, who were sentenced in the Dominican Republic. And he told Pierre that he knows those 2 guys and he's not willing to take them anywhere because the authorities were onto them and he'd be considered an accomplice in the smuggling. Pierre didn't know what to do, whether to get rid of him, throw him overboard, or what. So he told him, "Look, take this money and go somewhere. I'm not going to tell you where so you don't get mad." The guy understood, took the money, and continued the trip. After they covered the set distance, Christophe showed up in a sailboat and got to a spot near the Dominican Republic's maritime border. The pilots got off the sailboat there, then headed to St. Martin Island. From there, they kept moving from one island to another and later left from one of the cities. They flew to France, but somehow Pierre and Emmerich ended up going back to the Dominican Republic on the same boat they arrived on. Once they got to France, news of their escape spread like wildfire. All the news channels started talking about the story, and some even interviewed them to hear about their escape and how they got to France. Of course, they didn't reveal the details of the escape plan or who helped them. The info I just told you only came out later because if they had exposed everything, Pierre, Emmerich, and Christophe would have been in serious trouble. Anyway, after they arrived and shared their story, they got a lawyer to represent them. And right after news of their escape and arrival in France spread, the judge found out immediately. Christine, who was handling their case at first, has now ordered the arrest of each of them at their own homes since they're suspects in this case and are fleeing from another country. They can't just be left free, they need to be investigated and questioned in France as well. The first thing is they must be sent to pretrial detention. The surprising thing Christine uncovered during the investigation is that the arrest of the 4 suspects in the Dominican Republic for confiscating the contraband found on the plane wasn't just for the first smuggling trip. They'd actually completed 2 previous smuggling runs in the exact same way, using the same plane. In total, there were 3 trips made with these people on board. The flights involved the same 4 people, or sometimes they flew without the third pilot, who was a guy named Castani. But you might wonder, how did they even find out about all this? The first suspicious incident was actually a smuggling operation on a plane dated September 12, 2012, which was 3 months before the operation we were talking about. That plane landed at an airport in France, and the police noticed something odd about that flight. An airport employee saw the plane that day and got suspicious about how the passengers were acting. First, one of the passengers got off the plane, a businessman named Nicolas Bizabia, and he took down 10 suitcases along with the pilots. Bruno and Pascal were there too, and right away, a worker at the airport came over to help them unload the bags. You know how when a private plane lands, there are workers whose job is to take down the passengers' stuff. The worker started unloading the bags and was surprised because one of them was really heavy, over 50 kilograms. Suddenly, the businessman Nicolas told him not to touch the bags at all. The worker found that strange but didn't argue. Then, a few people showed up in 2 rental cars near the runway, even though it was forbidden. They unloaded the bags into the cars and drove off. No one found out what happened. What was inside the bags? Mostly it was stuff that wasn't allowed. After the cars left, no one could find out anything about the bags or the people who had them. A report came in about suspicious activity. The police investigation unit started looking into the trip, where it came from and what was inside the bags. The trip was also coming from the Dominican Republic, and they suspected it was a smuggling operation. They asked to be notified if the plane made another trip. Sure enough, after a while, they got a tip that the plane was about to take another flight, this time from France to Ecuador, and it would return again. The plane and the passengers on board included the businessman Nicolas and the pilots. The plane did take off and landed in Ecuador but needed to return to the airport in France where it had landed last time. However, when the police were waiting there, they got a report that the destination had been changed and the plane landed at another airport in Paris instead. When they contacted that airport, they were told only one man got off the plane, Nicolas, and he didn't have any luggage. So what they understood was that something happened between the flight from France to Ecuador, which is why they didn't bring any bags back. So what happened and why? They brought something with them that no one understood at first, but shortly after, they found out the plane was going on a 3rd trip from the Dominican Republic to France, the same trip we talked about at the start of the video. Back then, like we said, the Dominican Anti-Drug Agency raided the plane, arrested everyone, and found bags of contraband. So the officials in France realized their suspicions about the previous flights were right. They were probably smuggling illegal stuff on the plane. On this 3rd trip, they got caught again and were arrested in the Dominican Republic. Judge Christine, after gathering all the details from the 3 trips, tried to figure out who was responsible about organizing the smuggling operation. They conducted thorough inspections of a business aviation company and checked the documents they needed related to the flight arrangements. They also searched the homes of the company owners we mentioned, Pierre, Marc, and Fabrice. At that point, the authorities questioned them about the payment process for those 3 flights, how the payments were made, and who was responsible. They said no one paid anything for any of the 3 flights. She was surprised and asked, "How do you mean? On what basis were these flights operating for free? Who's covering the cost of fuel and pilot salaries if the client isn't paying anything? This whole thing didn't add up. He's using his brain unless you guys are the ones involved." The real mastermind behind the smuggling was a second, more dangerous possibility she had in mind, that the company had secretly received cash payments for the trips. So, was there any evidence at all linking the two to the case? Of course, they completely denied her claims and told her that just because she suspected something about the payment process, it didn't mean they were smugglers. But their words didn't matter to her. She charged them with organized international smuggling of contraband, and they're going to be jailed until the investigation is over and it's clear whether they're actually innocent or guilty. Imagine the prison they were sent to. The jail was full of high-profile contraband dealers. Christine kept insisting she wanted to know why the fees for the 3 trips weren't paid. She tried to find out if the money that was paid came into the company through fake invoices. She checked all the invoices that could match the trip costs, both fake and real. Among them, she found a legitimate invoice worth €95,000 in the name of a very well-known man in France, Nicolas Sarkozy, who was the president of France from 2007 to 2012. Christine suspected at the time that President Nicolas was involved in the smuggling operation, that he used the airline company to carry out the 3 trips. That was it. Nicolas replied and said that he flew on the plane a month before the smuggling incident with a friend, and it was his friend who rented the plane, not Nicolas. He told her that the invoice she got in Nicolas' name was actually paid by his friend but under Nicolas' name, just to make her believe and confirm he was innocent. She found out through his personal phone that he really did fly on the plane, and the invoice price matched the flight. It wasn't used for money laundering or anything like that. Besides, she was snooping around on his personal phone all the time, listening to all his calls to see if he was involved in any way, but in the end, she didn't find any proof against him. He was involved in smuggling banned stuff. And it turned out the guy actually got on that flight, and the ticket that was paid for wasn't fake. Lots of people talked about her, saying she was ratting on the boss and anyone in charge just to get famous and get promoted. But she said that's not true, that she's just doing her job, nothing more. Among the documents I looked into about the flights, one name popped up more than once: Frank Callan. This guy's French, lives in Romania, and claims to be a businessman. The weird thing is, he was registered as a passenger on the first flight but never got on the plane. So basically all the passengers were men. The 2 people registered for the trip were Nicolas Bizabia and Frank Callan, but only Nicolas actually boarded the plane. So, Christine decided to dig deeper into this guy. The first thing they did was tap his phone and started keeping an eye on him from afar in France. They found out he was heading to a bank to withdraw €95,000 in cash from a safe deposit box registered under a company linked to Nicolas Bizabia, the other businessman. The officials told the bank not to give him anything when he showed up. On the agreed day, they caught him and took him in for questioning. They had gathered a lot of information about him. He was a strange guy with a lot of money and an unusual lifestyle. His life was like that of rich guys. What I understood is that when Nicolas was arrested, he was actually working for Frank. He was managing Frank's money and had bank accounts under his companies where he put the funds. I suspected Nicolas might be a scapegoat for Frank. Nicolas was our pilot on all the flights, while Frank never showed up. It became clear that Frank was the middleman between the airline and the smugglers. The proof was that he owned the 3rd pilot, Castani, whom we mentioned was on the plane, and no one really understood what his role was or why he was there. I linked him to the airline, and that's how he managed to get involved. The plane managed to make a deal with the pilots to help with the smuggling operations. But that wasn't all. What was clear to Christine was that there was a man backing Frank, some hidden partner responsible for all the chaos. But who he was and what his name was, no one admitted to anything. I got some extra info about Frank Callan too. He used to hang out a lot at nightclubs in the French town of Saint-Tropez. That's where he met several people, including some smugglers. Specifically, he met a guy nicknamed Ryan and did some shady deals with him. But after a long and complicated investigation, Christine couldn't find out who Ryan really was. Things stayed like this for about a year after they arrived. By 2016, thanks to international cooperation, French authorities received information about several French citizens arrested for smuggling 500 grams of cocaine. Among them was a man living in Spain named Ryan Hano. After investigating further in France, they found out he was one of the people scheduled to be on the first flight with Nicolas and Frank. His real name is Ali Bouchereb, and he's known to the police as a smuggler. From his name, it's clear he has Arab origins. So it became obvious to us that the businessmen Nicolas Bizabia and Frank Callan and Ali Bouchereb, they're all involved in the smuggling case, and the pilots who were on those flights are probably involved too. The case stayed like that for 4 years until 2019, when the trial for the pilots started in France. Of course, the 3rd pilot and the businessman Nicolas were still in the Dominican Republic serving their sentences. The dispute in court was over whether the pilot is responsible for the bags on the plane or not, and whether they're generally responsible for the plane and its cargo. To get a clear answer, they called in 15 experienced pilots and asked them. Some of them said that usually the pilot isn't around during that time. They were loading the bags, but mostly people said no, it's not allowed to load anything unless I'm there. And the pilot has to be wise too. Like 26 bags coming from a country known for making and smuggling illegal stuff, how can you not be suspicious when you see that? Besides the pilot's certificates, they found more evidence on pilot Bruno's phone, text messages between him and the company owners, Pierre and Fabrice. We mentioned before that on the second trip, the plane returned to France empty with no bags. Bruno was texting them things like, "We checked the loaded shipment, told us about the source, and we're going back." But the plane came back without the shipment and nothing was found. Reporting it calls for suspicion. It's obvious they're involved in something illegal and scared of it. Their way of communicating was always coded and indirect. What happened makes it clear the pilots were involved and knew what they were carrying. Not only that, the pilots didn't realize that after their second flight, the investigators started to close in on them. One of the calls they intercepted was between Fabrice and Bruno, and it was clear from the call that both parties knew exactly what they were transporting and understood the whole situation. So there was no way to escape. We reached April 5, 2019, the day the verdict was announced. The pilots Bruno Oudes and Pascal Fourrier were each sentenced to 6 years in prison. The two company owners, Pierre-Marc and Fabrice Elcade, got the same sentence. As for Frank Collin, the businessman we talked about who used to work with Nicolas Bizabia, he was sentenced to 12 years. And El Bouchard, who was known as a drug dealer involved in the case, got 18 years. So where are you guys saying the case was solved? Of course, it has unknown aspects, like who sold them the materials and who the big players behind the case were. But none of these details were ever revealed. So what's the story? So it ended like that. Where are you getting that the story just started? In 2021, the Court of Appeals issued a verdict of acquittal for the pilots. How did that happen? At that time, they had appointed a new lawyer, and somehow this lawyer managed to convince the judges that the information previously presented, the messages and calls, wasn't enough evidence for a conviction. There was no solid and clear proof that they were involved. As for the claim that it's the pilot's job to check the bags and cargo loaded onto the plane, that's not true. The pilot isn't responsible for customs clearance. That's the customs department's job. Once the bag passes through the inspection section, no pilot has the authority to check it anymore. Passengers are asked about the contents of their bags, like a taxi driver checking what's inside a passenger's luggage. It seems the bags were loaded somehow without going through customs clearance. At the appeals court, the judge was convinced by the lawyer's argument and acquitted the two pilots. That's great, but even though they were cleared, both of them are on the run from the Dominican Republic. There's still an international arrest warrant out for them, so if they go to a country that cooperates with extradition, they'll be caught and sent back to serve their sentence. As for the female pilot, the contraband she had was confiscated. So today Nahid is still in the Dominican Republic and no one knows if they're going to hand her over to France or not. She didn't just leave with her friend, per guy. The story didn't end there. Actually, some crazier stuff happened. We talked about how the people who planned the pilot smuggling operation, Pierre, Emeric, and Christophe, wanted to keep it totally secret to avoid any legal trouble. But after the operation, Emeric decided to post a picture of himself online and didn't realize Pierre, a soldier, and one of the pilots were also visible in the photo taken out at sea. Once he posted it, the picture spread like wildfire and ended up. The story was all over the news in the Dominican Republic, and that's when the authorities there found out who was behind the pilot's escape. They issued international arrest warrants for the three, Pierre, Emeric, and Christophe. Since they had fled France, any country with an extradition treaty with France would arrest and imprison them in the Dominican Republic. Luckily for them, at that time, all three were still in France. If even one had been in the Dominican Republic, he would have been caught right away. Later, Christophe decided to take a risk, travel to Egypt, settle there, and get rid of his kidney troubles. But unfortunately, just 3 days after arriving, he was arrested, handed over to the Dominican authorities, and imprisoned. Pierre has been there for 2 years. After the story got out and he found out they were exposed, he decided to take out Emeric, who posted his picture and blew their cover. But Emeric caught wind of what Pierre was planning and disappeared from that moment on. As for businessman Nicolas Bizabia and the third pilot, Alain Castani, they're still stuck in the Dominican Republic waiting for their appeal ruling. And that brings us to the end of our story. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe so this channel can grow, hopefully. See you in the next video. Peace.